Happy Tuesday, everyone. It's great to see you all again. We have a lot to get into tonight, so I'm going to jump right in. Last week, we kicked off Epiphany, which is this weird and beautiful season in the church calendar that's basically about light and revelation and noticing. Not so much answers dropping out of the sky, but light breaking in sideways, unexpectedly and easy to miss. And in the series we're in, we're trying to become the kind of people who expect surprise, who practice attention, and recognize God's presence where we weren't trained to look for it. Last week we started with the Magi, these outsider astrologer priests who somehow see what the insiders, the Jewish king and religious authorities, all miss. Same star, different hearts. Tonight we're moving from the sky to a party. Because week 2 is the story of Jesus' first sign, as it's called, his first miracle in the Gospel of John. And it's not at a temple. It's not during a sermon. It's not on a mountain. It's not even what we would. It's not even during what we would consider much of a crisis. It's at a wedding reception, with food and music and laughter, and probably at least one tipsy uncle making a speech that nobody asked for. And that's already something worth sitting with. Not the uncle part so much, but if you were trying to show people that you're the Son of God, the light of the world, the one through whom the universe was made, and you wanted to start strong, you probably pick a moment with a little more broad public religious appeal. But Jesus' first recorded miracle happens in the ordinary, in celebration, in community, and it happens in the background. It's quiet and practical. It saves a family from public shame. And most people at the party don't even realize that it happened. That's our big idea tonight, that God often reveals himself not through spectacle, but through ordinary moments being quietly transformed. Which means, for us, if we're waiting on God to show up only in the crescendos of life, we might miss him. If we're waiting for God to show up only when life becomes dramatic enough to justify the interruption, we might miss him. Because sometimes the strange light of God doesn't arrive like a spotlight. Sometimes it arrives like a kitchen light flickering off and on at 11:30 p.m. when you're cleaning up after everyone else. So let's get into this story. We're looking at John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, which will be up on the screen. It goes like this. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to his servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. There's so many strange things about this story. So let's just walk through this. Jesus goes to a wedding in Cana, which is a small town in Galilee, which is the part of Judah that he was from. His mom is there, his disciples are there. It sounds like it's a great time. At some point, they run out of wine. And if you've ever read this story and you've thought, okay, first miracle, and it's basically just keeping the party going, you're not alone. That's a normal reaction. Some of you, especially if you grew up in church, were taught to read this story like Jesus is endorsing a particular beverage of choice, which is wild. Others of you might be thinking, wait, like, isn't the Bible supposed to be like not fun? All of these are valid reactions. Before we treat this like a little quirky miracle story, though, miracle. Before we treat this like a quirky little miracle story, we need to understand the cultural weight of what's happening here. In that world, Weddings weren't a 2-hour ceremony followed by a couple hours long reception. A wedding feast could last several days, sometimes a week. Why did we stop doing that? It is not like it is today. In this time and place, it was a communal event that stitched together a whole village. And hospitality in the ancient Near East wasn't like an Instagram moment to show off your creativity. It was about honor. It was about identity. It was about reputation. It's how you show publicly whether you're safe and generous and trustworthy. So if you run out of wine, it's a big deal. It exposed your poverty. I've talked about this before when we've talked about this story, but I know a little something about this because we ran out of drinks at my wedding. And I coordinated my own wedding, which if you know me, just makes all the sense in the world. And I will say for the record, I mostly killed it. Like I Leslie Noped that thing. I literally had a binder that had maps and instructions for where every person was supposed to be minute by minute. If you're someone that appreciates attention to detail, it was absolutely beautiful. I still have that binder because I'm still proud of it. But I definitely didn't order enough drinks. To be fair, one of our vendors told us one of the drinks would be like literally 100 times more than it was. But even so, when it happened, it wasn't a huge deal. It was a bummer. It was kind of awkward. But I don't think anyone thought, wow, Phil and Michaela must be really poor. I think people probably thought, maybe Phil shouldn't coordinate his own wedding. But at this wedding that we're looking at, running out of wine isn't just like this simple like, oh shoot, we have to switch to sparkling water. It was public embarrassment and shame. It's the kind of thing that becomes the family nickname for 20 years, or the story always associated with that family. Like, oh yeah, remember when the Owens ran out of wine? Losers. That would follow you around the rest of your life. In a shame and honor culture, this would be genuinely devastating. It could stain the start of a marriage. It could impact relationships. It could mark a family as careless or cheap. Beyond that, in the ancient Near East, hospitality for a wedding didn't just fall on the bride and groom or their families. This is so wild to me. It was something that the entire village took on. So everyone was expected to bring wine for the reception. So to run out meant shame for everybody, as it showed that they couldn't even collectively scrape together enough wine to properly celebrate this new marriage. And so I don't want you to miss this. Jesus doesn't step in to rescue the bride or groom from some big, deep theological problem. He steps in to rescue people from social collapse, from humiliation, from a moment that would feel small to the universe, but huge to the people living inside of it. And so if you've ever wondered whether God cares about the everyday stuff, the embarrassing stuff, the stuff that doesn't look important or spiritual, this story says absolutely. Absolutely he does. Now, in this story, Mary notices the problem before anyone else seems to. And I love that. Because this is just what moms do, right? It's like a superpower. Moms can detect a crisis from across the room. Mary notices what's happening and says to Jesus, they have no more wine. And Jesus responds in a way that on first read sounds crazy. Like I wouldn't talk to my mom that way. In the original language, it's something like, ma'am, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. It's a phrase that can sound really rude in English, especially the way that he says just, woman, what does that have to do with me? But it's not necessarily disrespectful in that culture. It's more just very formal, which it's formal to the point of being cold. And it shocks a lot of scholars because of how much distance Jesus seems to put between himself and his mother with this response. But I think, this is just my personal opinion, I think this is actually an incredibly human and tender and playful moment between Jesus and his mom. Jesus is partying with his friends. He's having a great time, and his mom interrupts him, says there's no more wine. And he sort of responds like, oh yeah? Whose problem is that? I'm not on the clock here, lady. But Mary's response is everything in seeing what's going on. There's an understanding between Jesus and Mary here, because she essentially ignores Jesus' pushback, right? He says that to her, and she just turns to the servants and says the most underrated line in the whole story: do whatever he tells you. She has every confidence that Jesus is going to make this right, despite what he just said to her. He says, why is that my problem? And she says to the servants, do whatever this guy tells you. And then what happens? Jesus takes care of it, just like Mary knew he would. So now we get to the actual miracle. There are 6 large stone water jugs sitting nearby. These are jars used for Jewish purification and ceremonial washing. They hold a lot of water. Best estimates are around 180 gallons altogether. So this isn't a cute, like, Brita pitcher that we're talking about here, okay? These are big, heavy jars that held enough to fill a hot tub. Jesus tells the servants, fill them with water. So they fill them to the brim. Then he says, now draw out some and take it to the master of the banquet, which is an awesome title, master of the banquet. This basically would have been the wedding coordinator today, but master of the banquet sounds way better. And I think, like week-long wedding receptions, we should bring back master of the banquet. But that's it. That's all Jesus does. There's no prayer or big speech. There's no crowd gathering. There's no, hey, everybody, check this out moment. And if you're a skeptic, you might think, well, isn't that convenient? No one really saw this happen. And I get it, because we're talking about a miracle, and that already triggers the whole modern brain response of, yeah, I'm going to need to see the receipts on that to know what actually happened here. But whether you believe miracles can happen or not, this story wants you to notice a few things. First, Jesus doesn't do this publicly. He does it in the background. The servants are the ones in the know. The master of the banquet is the one who tastes it. The bride and groom don't even have a moment to say thank you to Jesus, at least not in the story. They might not have even been aware that anything was wrong at all. This isn't a miracle designed to prove a point to the crowd. It's a miracle designed to quietly preserve the honor of some of his friends. Second, the transformation happens in a totally ordinary process. It happens through obedience in small steps. Fill the jars, draw some out, carry it over. If you wanted to be dramatic, this is where you'd put thunder sound effects and cue the fog machines, but John doesn't do that. John keeps it almost stubbornly ordinary. And third, the water jars matter. That's an important detail. They're tied to purification and to ritual, to the old way of marking who's clean and who's not. John is telling us as readers from the very beginning that Jesus isn't making a little party better. He's showing you what he came for, what he came to do. He's taking the old symbols of purification and he's filling them with something new. Instead of water for washing, it's wine for celebrating and enjoying. And again, most of the people at the party never even notice that this is going on. The master of the banquet goes to the groom and says something like, most people serve the good wine first and then bring out the cheap stuff later, but you saved the best for now. Which is funny because I can imagine the groom saying, yeah, totally, that was the plan. That's what we did. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, getting credit for something that you didn't do and being like, yes, absolutely. It's exactly what we intended all along. But let's not miss what that line means. The master of the banquet says, you saved the best for now. The revelation in the story isn't simply that Jesus can do cool tricks by manipulating molecules. The revelation is about the kind of God that we're dealing with. A God who saves the best for now. A God who doesn't run out of the good stuff. Which, if you've been through enough life, you know that can be a hard thing to believe. It's easy to feel like maybe God's given up on you, or you wasted the good stuff and now you're stuck with the leftovers. But John wants us to see that that's just not how God works. So let's move from this first century wedding to your actual life this week. Let's talk about interruption. The title of this talk is When God Interrupts the Ordinary. And that sounds inspiring until it actually happens. Nobody likes an interruption. We like plans. We like schedules. And if you're someone who coordinates their own wedding like me, you like being able to predict every minute of your day. And I'm not saying we're necessarily controlling. I might be, but I'm not saying that about you. I'm saying it's a normal human condition to want to make life predictable with routines and schedules and plans. So when we say God interrupts, we often picture something huge, a career change, a big crisis, a mystical moment. But this story is an interruption in a very, very small, very human way. It's not thunder and lightning, it's just a shortage of drink. It's an awkward moment in the back of a kitchen. And sometimes that's how it goes. God doesn't interrupt you with a vision. God interrupts you with a conversation that you didn't want to have. God interrupts you with feedback that you can't unhear. God interrupts you with a need that you didn't plan for. God interrupts you with a person who shows up in your life at the wrong time and then becomes the reason you change. The question is, what do we do when God interrupts? Because the truth is, most of us treat interruption as an enemy, as a problem that we have to eliminate, a thing to get through so that we can get back to real life. But what if interruption is where God does some of his best work? Think about how much of the life of Jesus is interruption. People interrupt him with questions. Kids interrupt him running up to him. A desperate woman interrupts him by reaching for his cloak. A blind man interrupts him by yelling at him. His friend interrupts him by dying unexpectedly. Jesus is constantly being pulled off script. And I don't want to romanticize this because some interruptions are traumatic. Some interruptions are not God's plan. They're just the brutal reality of living in a world where people and things fall apart. We don't need to slap an overly spiritual sticker on every hardship, but we also don't need to assume that God only shows up when things are tidy. In this story, the interruption is ordinary, and Jesus meets it with generosity. Which brings us to another question. Where are you currently experiencing interruption? Some of you are experiencing interruption in your job. Plans change, a boss left, budgets get cut. A project that should have taken 2 weeks is now stuck in an endless Slack thread. Some of you are experiencing interruption in your body, a diagnosis, a new limitation, a constant fatigue that makes everything harder. Some of you are experiencing interruption in relationships, a friendship shifting, a marriage under strain or ending, a kid going through something that you can't just fix for them. And when these things happen, the temptation is to see the interruption as proof that God has left, God is absent. But this story suggests something else, another possibility. Sometimes the interruption is the doorway. Sometimes the interruption is where strange light shows up, not to magically perform, but to quietly transform us. Now, I want to focus on who actually sees what happens in this story. The crowd doesn't, the bride and groom don't, the important people don't, the servants do. The servants are the ones hauling the water. The servants are the ones doing the work. The servants are the ones that are told, fill the jars, which, by the way, is a ridiculous ask. Because if you're a servant and you've just been told all the wine is gone, you're thinking, cool, we're all getting fired. And then Jesus gives them this seemingly ridiculous and completely random task, especially given the problem at hand. We've run out of wine, and Jesus says, go fill those jars with water. If you've ever worked waitstaff, you can imagine their confusion and also the things that they were probably saying to each other while they filled up the jars. But this is one of those details that can slide by, but is huge, because it means that the people closest to the miracle are the people doing the most ordinary work, which is how life actually works. Some of you do jobs that feel invisible. You clean things, you stock shelves, you manage logistics, you answer emails, you balance budgets, you change diapers, some literal, some metaphorical. You cook dinner. You do the behind-the-scenes stuff that keeps life and companies running. And you've maybe assumed that God's real work happens somewhere else, like in a monastery or a church sanctuary or in someone else's dramatic story. But in this story, the people doing the unnoticed work are the ones who get to see. Which makes me wonder if part of Learning to see strange light is learning to value the backstage. Because most of us try to live our lives in the spotlight, right? We want visible success, the obvious wins, the story that we can tell at a party. But God seems to do a lot of his best work backstage, in kitchens, in mundane obedience, and in unseen service. There's a line in the story that says, when no one knew where the wine came from, the servants knew. I want to sit with that for just a second. The servants knew. Sometimes the people closest to what God is doing are the ones who aren't getting credit for it. Sometimes you're doing the faithful, boring thing, and nobody claps, nobody notices. And then at some point, someone tastes the results and says, this is amazing. And they have no idea that it came through your steady, faithful, unseen obedience. And so if you've ever felt like your life is mostly filling jars, I just want to say you're in good company. And you may just have a front row seat to what God is up to. Now, if you're skeptical, you might hear all this and think, okay, cool metaphor, but did this actually happen? And that's a fair question. John calls this a sign, which means it's not really about the event itself. It's a pointer. It's a clue towards something bigger. So even if you're not sure what you believe about miracles or this story at all, it asks you something. What if the divine shows up in the ordinary? What if the sacred sneaks into the everyday? What if the moments you dismiss as boring and inconvenient or even traumatic are the very moments where God is quietly doing something new? That question alone is worth carrying, even if you're not ready to answer it. Let's talk about the wine again for just a minute. On the surface, wine is just wine. It's a symbol of joy and celebration and abundance. But in the story, it's also a signal about the kind of kingdom Jesus is bringing. Jesus doesn't start his ministry by taking something away. He starts by giving. He doesn't start by scolding. He starts by saving people from shame. He doesn't start by demanding attention. He starts by quietly blessing a celebration. I think that's worth noticing. Because if your picture of God is mostly disappointment, mostly disapproval, mostly do better, then this story in John 2 shows you something else. God shows up playfully and generously. And the line from the master of the banquet, you save the best for now, becomes almost this like accidental prophecy. If you've been through loss, you might hear that and think, sure, that sounds nice. Because life can feel like the best is behind you. The best days were in your 20s, or the best relationships were the ones that you lost, or the best version of you was before the burnout, or before the divorce, or before the diagnosis, or before the betrayal. But the strange light of Epiphany keeps insisting on this stubborn hope. God doesn't run out of the good stuff. Now, I'm not saying everything gets easier. I'm not saying we don't grieve. I'm not saying trauma disappears. I'm saying the presence of Jesus means the future is not closed. It means God can bring best wine moments in places that feel like empty jars. So how do we practice attention to this? We're near the end, I promise. How do we become the kind of people who don't miss the quiet miracles? I want to give you just 3 ways to hold this story in your real life this week. 3 things to pay attention to. The first is pay attention to what you're tempted to dismiss. The servants could have rolled their eyes. They could have said, this is pointless. Some of you maybe are being asked to do something that feels small or boring or unnecessary. A hard conversation, a small act of apology, a shift in your habit or boundary. Sometimes God invitations come dressed like errands. Pay attention to that. The second is pay attention to shame. Jesus' miracle here is basically shame prevention, which means if you're carrying shame, Jesus cares about that. If you feel like you're failing at life, Jesus doesn't show up to mock you. He shows up to cover you, to help you, to quietly save you. I think this is one of the things that no matter where you stand with any of this stuff, it's one of the things that makes Jesus so compelling. Not because these stories are easy and simple, but because the character of Jesus is impossible to ignore. He doesn't crush fragile people. He doesn't humiliate the embarrassed. He protects them. And then third, pay attention to the people backstage. Pay attention to the unseen labor of others. Who's been filling jars around you lately? And what would it look like for you to thank them, to honor them, or to lighten their load? Backstages are everywhere. In parenting, in friendships, at work. Pay attention to them this week. Before we wrap up, I also want to give you a few reflection questions to think about this week. It's really easy to hear all this and let it roll right off of you if we don't slow down and reflect. It's easy to just consume another story and move on. So in addition to that list I just gave, here are some questions to think about this week. The first is, where has your week been interrupted lately? And what's your default response to that? Is it resistance? Is it resentment? Numbness? Curiosity? How do you react to being interrupted? The second is, what part of your life feels like filling jars, steady and unnoticed? What would it look like to believe that God can work in that part of your life? And then finally, where are you carrying shame, embarrassment, or fear of being exposed? If Jesus is the kind of person who saves people from shame, what might it look like to bring that place into his light? So here's what I hope that you hear tonight. Epiphany is about revelation, but revelation doesn't always look like a spotlight. Sometimes it looks like a wedding reception about to go off the rails. Sometimes it looks like a mom noticing the need before anyone else. Sometimes it looks like the waitstaff hauling water. Sometimes it looks like a quiet transformation that most people miss. And maybe that's the point. Because if God only shows up in dramatic moments, then most of our life would feel godless. Most of your week would feel irrelevant. But if God shows up in kitchens and awkward shortages and ordinary obedience and unseen service, then the invitation gets a lot closer. It means God might be nearer than you think. And listen, I know some of you are tired. You're not asking for a miracle at a wedding. You're asking for a miracle in your anxiety or your depression or your finances or your relationship or your addiction. This story isn't a guarantee that everything gets fixed on demand. You don't need me to tell you that. But it is a revelation of who Jesus is: playful, loving, and generous. He meets people in ordinary need. He saves them from shame. He brings joy. And he does it often without making a big scene. So this week, practice attention. When you're doing the mundane thing, pay attention. When your plans get interrupted, pay attention. When you're tempted to believe that the best is behind you, pay attention to that. Because strange light has a way of showing up in the places that we're not trained to look. And maybe, just maybe, the best wine isn't only a someday promise. Maybe it's also God's quiet, stubborn way of saying, I'm not done yet. Hold on to that hope. I'm not done yet.